The abandoned Rochester subway system wasn't just a transportation project, rather, it was a botched attempt to spur growth and modernize a small city. As a result, approximately 7 miles of abandoned tunnel still haunt the town to this very day. So why did they build it? What went wrong, and what will become of this eerie forgotten underground network? Join me to find out, as today we discover the history of the forgotten Rochester subway system. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. First off, let's confront what is perhaps the weirdest part of this story. Why would a city with a small population of just 300,000 even decide to build a massive subway in the first place? Well, the main motivation was the hope that a decent public transportation infrastructure could foster explosive growth in the area and significantly benefit the residents. Although the project did receive universal support from local journalists, the Chamber of Commerce, and labor unions, it was Mayor Edgerton who was the main driving force behind the Rochester subway. Born in April 1847 in Belfast, New York, Edgerton moved to Rochester at the age of 11. His father had a thriving lumber and construction business in the area and wanted to be closer to his enterprise. So growing up in Rochester, young Edgerton learned much about the construction industry and was inspired by the positive impact of big infrastructure projects around the East Coast back then. He inherited the company in 1880 and delivered significant construction projects, including churches and government or commercial buildings. After a decade of successful business operations, Edgerton started considering a political career. His first mayoral campaign in 1895 failed miserably, but it didn't stop him from pursuing his dream. His determination paid off when he finally succeeded 12 years later in 1907. As mayor, he oversaw an unprecedented increase in infrastructure investments, including a flood wall protecting the city from the river, as well as waterworks providing the town with fresh water from the local lake. But arguably, his legacy would be the Rochester subway. First proposed in the early 1900s and finally approved in 1921, just 1 year before his death. It could be argued that the subway was almost an afterthought to a much bigger undertaking, the rerouting of the Erie Canal between 1910 and 1918. Originally completed back in 1825, the canal was probably one of the most significant infrastructure developments of the 19th century, at least as far as the East Coast is concerned. At that time, it was the second longest canal in the world, with a total length of 363 miles. It was also the first navigable waterway between the Atlantic Ocean and the Great Lakes, which enabled effective transport of people and goods across this rapidly developing region. The canal's original route went directly through downtown Rochester, so the local authorities moved it to pass the city in the south. It's important to note here that this project also received significant support from Mayor Edgerton. So, after the canal was successfully rerouted, an empty canal bed was all that remained in the middle of the city. This is when an idea emerged to convert the old riverbed into a subway tunnel. It made sense. The terrain was already lower than the surrounding ground, and the soil was relatively easy to work with. And so it was. In 1922, construction began. Well, appearing easy on paper, the Rochester subway was, in fact, a very ambitious, if not crazy, undertaking for such a small town. For starters, the canal bed had to be widened and deepened by 5 feet in all directions. This required the removal of 1 million cubic yards of soil, and despite initial assertions, a significant amount of blasting was also required to remove rock from the riverbed. We also have to remember that despite the big technological advancements of the time, a significant amount of work still had to be done by hand. Workers did use various steam cranes, but the construction remained labor-intensive and very time-consuming. Furthermore, it's not like the trains could just run on top of sand. Rather, the subway required a complex mix of concrete flat slabs, steel beams, and concrete decks. This called for precise engineering and the utilization of considerable material resources, including 198 spans compiled of 1,280 steel beams. Needless to say, it was expensive. Very expensive. The city is said to have been paying back the bonds for construction of this subway system well into the 1960s. Anyhow, despite the above challenges, the subway finally opened for passenger service on December the 1st, 1927. In addition to being an engineering marvel, the subway was also a significant feat of architecture. One of its notable features was the utilization of the Second Genesee Aqueduct, an early example of incorporating a historic structure into modern design. The new public transportation line was an overnight success. Soon, the neighboring interborough lines were connected, and the Rochester and Syracuse Railroad started to take advantage of this amazing infrastructure. The line usage steadily increased, with a peak observed during World War II. This is because at the time there was a severe gas and rubber rationing in place, forcing people to switch from using cars to using public transportation. Hence, the subway line saw annual traffic of around 5 million people back then. For a brief moment, it looked like this ambitious project might just succeed. Of course, that would not turn out to be true, as was the case with so many other examples of public transportation infrastructure in the US. Everyone immediately went back to driving cars right after the war. Not long after that, the Rochester subway system started to struggle. As early as 1952, the weekday service had to be reduced to save cost. The trains also stopped running on Sundays altogether. Not long after that, in 1955, the City Council voted to close the line entirely. On June the 29th, 1956, the passenger service on the Rochester subway made its final trip. And sad as that is, it might be in the interest of the Rochester taxpayers, as throughout its lifespan, this subway system always operated at a loss. That being said, after passenger services were closed, part of the line was still used for transporting cargo, and another part was converted into a highway currently known as Interstate 490. And in this capacity, the line was technically used for another 40 years. This was only possible because Gannett Newspapers, the most prominent American newspaper publisher of the time, was originally founded in Rochester. They maintained a presence in the region and were the last entity to use part of the line. In 1986, they moved to Arlington County, Virginia, and by 1996, ceased all printing operations in Rochester. So once they closed shop, a rapid downward spiral followed, and by the mid-90s, the subway had officially been abandoned. These days, anyone who ventures into this area sees a huge variety of graffiti art, a body of work that spans decades. Though visitation is illegal and not recommended, since there have been reports of issues with its structural integrity. Following years of neglect, the structure can truly collapse at any point. So it's curious that when authorities proposed filling in the abandoned tunnel, the Rochester public responded with a resounding no. People stated that the subway is an integral part of the city's legacy, and in a sense, serves as a reminder of its former glory. The members of the public had a few ideas for repurposing the structure, including, among others, creating an underground retail center, establishing art galleries, or even just reflooding the tunnel to restore it in its original state. All the same, their wishes have been in vain, as nothing has been done in the past 20 years. Today, it's not easy to get such a vast infrastructure project going again. The biggest challenge is making the proposal economically viable, as to make these tunnels safe or usable would require a substantial investment. After all, the original development took over 30 years to pay back, and as we now know, the subway generated losses throughout its entire existence. Which actually begs a question and makes me consider a different perspective. Should public transportation even be a for-profit enterprise? Well, it does make sense that to be profitable, a system should only be built in areas that host a population of a certain quantity, but maybe there are other non-financial benefits that justify subsidizing systems like these. What's your take on this? Let us know in the comment section below. As things currently stand, the subway will be reflooded and transformed as a part of the ROC and Riverway program, which is supposed to be implemented between 2024 and 2026. But we'll have to wait and see what actually happens. As, like I said before, many locals see this system, these dilapidated tunnels, as a part of Rochester's legacy. But putting that aside, whatever happens here to the old system, its story remains a symbol of times when anything seemed possible in America, and the sky was truly the limit. I don't know about you, but I personally yearn for that same sense of optimism, and I hope you've managed to experience at least some of that spirit by watching this video. Otherwise, I thank you so much for subscribing, and until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.